breaking news here in Batshit Bonkers Britain, where on the side of the river Cherwell, a huge industrial level waste tip has sprung up. This is environmental and industrial level corruption between councils. This huge mound of rubbish is 6 metres high, 150 metres long, and weighs well over 100,000 tonnes. The Environment Agency knew about it way back in March, but did bugger all about it. Now they've slapped a trespass order against it so that you can't go and take pictures of the things that they didn't do anything about. It is truly a monument to a broken society. A functioning society would be able to clear that shit up in about 3 days, but of course the Environment Agency say they can't afford it, so they're just going to watch it fall into the river. In other news, Ed Miliband, a moron of epic proportions, has cost us another 450 jobs, this time up in Scotland. Exxon says it has to close its operations there because it simply can't afford our energy, which is the highest pricing in all of Western Europe. 60% of your energy bill is made up of costs because of net zero and the belief in climate change. Of course, one of the biggest environmental catastrophes of our time, apart from the massive landfill tip in Cherwell, is these huge solar farms and these wind turbines that no one knows how we're really going to use effectively or how we're ever going to recycle. And finally, Nigel Farage may have said something when he was at school that might have offended some people that they've just remembered, and it's really shocking. I mean, bugger me sideways with a broom pole, truly. At school, I had a pair of green leggings that I thought were fantastic. I once twatted Alan Chung in maths because he did his fractions faster than me. And I remember my backpack had a large clock on it, and I thought that was cool. You can't really make up for what you did when you were young. For Christ's sake, find something more important to pick on Farage about than that. That's it, my darlings. Batshit Bonkers Britain.
Katie Hopkins' breakdown of Batshit Bonkers Britain delivers a sharp, condensed indictment of a country she argues is failing at the most basic level. The 100,000-ton industrial waste mountain on the River Cherwell becomes her central symbol of national decay. A towering mess that the Environment Agency knew about for months, but chose to ignore, only stepping in to block the public from seeing the evidence of its own negligence. To Hopkins, this isn't just environmental mismanagement. It's proof of a system that has collapsed into corruption, excuses, and bureaucratic paralysis. She extends this critique to the wider political landscape, blaming Ed Miliband's energy policies for driving Exxon out of Scotland and costing 450 jobs. With Britain now facing the highest energy prices in Western Europe, Hopkins frames the nation's net zero ambitions as an ideological luxury the public can't afford, even supposedly green. Solutions like vast solar farms and wind turbines, she argues, are future environmental disasters waiting to happen, with no coherent plan for recycling or long-term use. Finally, Hopkins mocks the sudden resurfacing of a decades-old-school anecdote involving Nigel Farage, using it to argue that Britain is obsessing over trivialities while ignoring genuine crises. In her telling, the country is distracted, mismanaged, and losing its grip on reality, a place where political theatre replaces competence and a literal mountain of rubbish stands as a monument to national decline.
I read this report in full last night, and it's a very powerful report, and it goes through some interpretations of how Islam might be used by grooming gang members to justify their behaviour. Can you tell us more?
Yes, well, it's written by Dr. Mark Dury, who is an Australian academic expert on Islam and Islamic theology, and he highlights in particular 8 significant doctrines of Islam that have been used or can be used to justify some of the horrific abuse that we've all heard about with these grooming gangs, and he kind of argues that it ought to be called Islamic grooming gangs rather than Asian, which is a much broader term, or even Pakistani, because there are different ethnicities prophecies involved. And he says there's doctrines like the treatment of women and the superiority of Muslims over non-Muslims in the Quran, the treatment of, the way that women ought to dress and cover up or hide themselves in the presence of men, the no actual age of consent or minimum age of marriage in terms of Islamic theology. Even justification of sex slaves can be found in the Quran and in Islamic theology and hadith, and he saw that with Islamic State reviving that kind of idea. So he's saying a lot of this stuff can be justified with Islamic theology and has been 8 different doctrines involved, and therefore we ought to be alert to that. And of course we've seen the government try to commission and launch a national inquiry into this, and 5 grieving gun victims who were initially on the panel resigned, and part of their complaint, well perhaps the main part of their complaint, was really sort of expanding the remit of the inquiry and not looking at religion was one of their key complaints, because they've seen this in their abuse, they've experienced it, and part of their abuse has been religious in motivation and origin, sometimes forced into Sharia marriages called kafir, referred to as worthless, and you're referred to as because you're non-Muslim, we're justified in abusing you in this way, and all of that kind of thing has happened. That's in the testimonies of victims that we've read and that are in this report here. So you can see that Islam is a key factor in very much of this abuse.
Do we know if any of the men who've been convicted, who were perhaps Pakistani origin, were citing the Quran as a defence?
Some of the victims have said yes, they cited the Quran. They even got sometimes their victims to memorise parts of the Quran. They read it out. They prayed ahead of abusing them. We helped one victim who'd had 4 forced Sharia marriages to her perpetrators, the people who abused her, and then of course they divorced them, just saying I divorced you 3 times, and all of that kind of thing goes on as well. So there has been, in some cases, not necessarily all cases, a very significant Islamic aspect to this abuse that is not being talked about. This is partly why we commissioned this report, wanted to get this report out to say, look, Islam is a factor in this and we can't ignore it, and if you're going to look at it properly and have a national inquiry, as we should, then religion ought to be talked about as well, not just ethnicity, and that's a key factor, and the victims themselves want to see it properly addressed.
And one of the points that the report makes is that because the West and our countries become so secular, we have forgotten how important religion is in setting culture. So we've almost ignored the influence of Islam and thought, well, how can that possibly justify anybody's behaviour? Or we've thought of all religions as being like Christianity, which obviously does place women as equal, doesn't allow treatment like that.
Yes, exactly. There's a real religious illiteracy in our culture at the moment, and an assumption that all religions are sort of effectively equal. I remember discussing with colleagues in my workplace when I worked in finance, and I'd say, well, actually, Muhammad was a war leader and he killed lots of people. They're like, that can't be true. He's a religious leader, because they're thinking about it in terms of Christianity. Well, historically, that is true. That's clearly in the doctrine of Islam. That's in the history of Muhammad. That's in the text that Muslims revere. So yes, we're sort of not really understanding Islam. Many people in our culture don't understand what Islam is really like, haven't read the text themselves, including most Muslims actually, haven't read the Quran for themselves, don't really know what it teaches. They're kind of cultural Muslims, have a sense of, well, we go have this community and this kind of religion without really understanding what it's like. But what we're saying is, if you do look at the text, and if you do think about what the teaching is, you do look at the example of Muhammad and so on,